You are a priest in 1396, standing in the cold stone halls of Westminster Abbey. Your breath mist rises in the autumn air as you hold your prayer book, watching with interest as servants hurry about, getting ready for what courtiers say will be the most unusual royal wedding England has ever seen. The bride has come from France, a princess, they say, the daughter of King Charles himself. You've blessed many marriages and united countless hands in marriage, but you've never seen such excitement at court. When the great oak doors swing open, and the wedding party steps inside, you can hardly believe your eyes. The groom, King Richard II, is an impressive figure at 29. He is tall and regal, his golden hair catching the filtered light from the stained glass windows. Beside him walks a child barely reaching his elbow, her tiny hand swallowed by his gloved palm. She looks no older than 6 or 7 years, this little princess, in her elaborate French gown, her dark hair braided with pearls that seem too heavy for her small head. You steady yourself against the altar rail. This is Isabella of Valois, the new Queen of England. During your lifetime, you've seen brides as young as 12 or 13. Political matches are the norm for noble families. After all, you understand the times. Life is brief and uncertain. The Great Plague swept through just 50 years ago, taking half the population. Kings must secure alliances when they can, and marriages create bonds more lasting than any scroll or seal. As the ceremony starts, you observe the child's face. She seems more curious than scared. Her large dark eyes take in the grandeur around her, the soaring Gothic arches, the flickering candles, and the nobles dressed in their finest silks and velvets. When King Richard speaks his vows, his voice is gentle, almost protective. This is not a monster marrying a child for selfish reasons. This is a king fulfilling his duty to his realm, securing peace with France through this sacred bond. The marriage will not be consummated, and everyone understands this. The little queen will be raised and educated at the English court until she comes of age. That is how things are done. You bless their union with a steady voice, though your heart beats oddly as you announce them husband and wife. Watching this tiny girl become Queen of England, you can't help but wonder what fate awaits her in the dangerous game of royal politics. Before diving into these forgotten stories of survival and suffering, if you enjoy uncovering the hidden truths of history, consider liking and subscribing for more content like this. Please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it amazing that we can explore these ancient stories together from different parts of the world, connected by our shared curiosity about the past. The marriage of Isabella Valois to Richard II was never meant to be a love story. It was a masterpiece of medieval diplomacy, a piece moved on a chessboard to end one of the most destructive conflicts in European history, the 100 Years' War. To understand Isabella's fate, we must first grasp the world she was born into and the forces that shaped her short, tragic life. Isabella was born on November 9, 1389, at the Louvre Palace in Paris. She was the eldest daughter of one of medieval Europe's most troubled kings. Her father, King Charles VI of France, suffered from bouts of madness that may have caused frightening moments for the young princess. Known as Charles the Mad, her father's condition would sometimes change him from a capable ruler into a raving lunatic who forgot his own identity. He believed he was made of glass, or refused to bathe for months at a time. Imagine little Isabella's childhood in the opulent but unstable French court. One day, her father might bounce her on his knee, showering her with gifts and attention. The next, she might find him cowering in a corner, screaming that assassins were coming to kill him, or standing still for hours, convinced that if he moved, his glass body would shatter into pieces. The palace servants would hustle the children away during these episodes, but fear and confusion lingered in young Isabella's eyes. Her mother, Isabella of Bavaria, was a strong woman trying to hold the kingdom together during her husband's incapacity. Beautiful and intelligent, Isabel had her own political ambitions and knew that her children were valuable assets in the tangled web of European politics. She watched her eldest daughter closely, knowing that Isabella's beauty and royal blood would one day secure a vital alliance for France. The world Isabella was born into was one of near constant warfare. For nearly 60 years, England and France had been locked in a brutal conflict that devastated both kingdoms. The 100 Years' War began over English claims to the French throne, but turned into something far more complicated. It became a struggle for national identity, economic power, and territorial control that consumed generations. French villages lay in ruins from English raids. English nobles drained their wealth financing campaigns across the Channel. Both kingdoms were exhausted, their treasuries empty, their people tired of war. By the 1390s, there were whispers of peace in both courts. But peace required more than just words. It needed bonds that couldn't easily be broken. That is where 6-year-old Isabella entered the scene. The grand theater of European politics. The idea of marrying Isabella to Richard I came up during secret talks between French and English ambassadors in 1395. Richard had been heartbroken by the death of his beloved first wife, Anne of Bohemia, the year before. Anne, known as Good Queen Anne, was loved by the English people for her kindness and charity. Her death from plague left Richard not only grieving but also without an heir, a risky situation for any medieval king. His advisors urged him to marry quickly, but initially, Richard resisted. He had genuinely cared for Anne, which was rare among royal unions. The idea of replacing her felt like a betrayal, but duty to his country ultimately took precedence. When the French ambassadors arrived with a proposal that could end the war, Richard became more receptive. The French offer was bold. They proposed not just the hand of the king's eldest daughter, but also a dowry of 800,000 francs, an enormous sum that would significantly replenish England's depleted treasury. More importantly, they offered a 28-year truce, long enough for a whole generation to grow up without experiencing war. However, there was one major hurdle. Isabella was only 6 years old, which was quite young for a royal bride by medieval standards. Most political marriages involved girls who were closer to adolescence, but the French negotiators claimed that this very youth was an advantage. The marriage would represent a fresh start, free from the hatred and bloodshed that had marred relations between the two kingdoms. Isabella would be raised in the English court, learning English customs and loyalties. By the time she was ready to be queen consort, she would be as much English as she was French. Richard's advisors were split on the issue. Some saw the sense in the proposal. The dowry alone could support the royal household for years, and the long truce would let England focus on other threats, especially the growing power of Scotland and ongoing rebellions in Ireland. Others were concerned about the precedent of marrying a child so young, fearing it would scandalize even the medieval nobility. But Richard was intrigued by something else entirely. Court watchers noted that when he saw the miniature portrait of Isabella, sent by the French ambassadors, his expression softened. Here was a child who needed protection, guidance, and care. Some whispered that the childless king saw this arrangement as more than just a political alliance. It was also an opportunity for him to be a father as well as a husband. Negotiations stretched on for months, with ambassadors crossing the Channel repeatedly to work out the details. Every aspect of Isabella's future was debated and agreed upon. She would keep her French servants and ladies in waiting. She would be allowed to practice French customs and maintain contact with her family. Most importantly, they all agreed that the marriage would not be consummated until she reached physical maturity, a safeguard explicitly included in the treaty. Meanwhile, in Paris, 6-year-old Isabella played with her dolls, unaware that her future was being negotiated in council chambers and recorded in wax-sealed documents. Her tutors began teaching her English phrases, and seamstresses started working on a trousseau fit for a queen. She was told she would marry a great king across the water, but at 6, the idea felt as unreal to her as the fairy tales her nurses told at bedtime. The wedding ceremony occurred twice, reflecting the diplomatic complexity of the alliance. Isabella was only 7 when she wed Richard II at the English-controlled port of Calais on October 31, 1396. This first ceremony was small, with mainly negotiators and high-ranking nobles from both kingdoms in attendance. Calais, as English territory on French soil, provided neutral ground for this significant event. Standing in the Grand Hall of Calais Castle, Isabella must have felt overwhelmed by the moment's importance. She wore a gown of cloth of gold, so heavy with embroidery and pearls that she needed help walking. Her new husband knelt to her level to exchange rings, and witnesses noted how gently he lifted her chin when she seemed frightened by the nobles looking at her. A year later, she was crowned queen in Westminster Abbey. Allegedly, several people died in the crush to catch a glimpse of the famous young bride. The English people had heard stories about their new child queen, and curiosity drew large crowds to London for the coronation. The ceremony was a grand display of royal pageantry. meant to show both the English nobility and foreign observers that this unusual marriage had full support from the crown. Isabella processed through London's streets in a litter adorned with English roses and French lilies, symbolizing the union of the two kingdoms. She wore a crown specially made for her small head, and her train was carried by English duchesses chosen to serve as her guardians and teachers. The crowds lining the streets shouted blessings in English, which she was just beginning to understand, but she smiled and waved as she had been taught. The coronation feast that followed lasted 3 days, featuring entertainment that included jugglers, musicians, and elaborate theatrical presentations depicting the bright future this marriage could bring. Both kingdoms. Isabella sat at the high table beside Richard, picking at her food with the careful manners her French tutors had drilled into her, while nobles toasted the health of the child queen. But even as the celebrations continued, courtiers were already beginning to wonder how long this peace would last. Medieval truces, no matter how elaborately negotiated, were fragile things. Richard, too, despite his current power, was not universally loved by his nobles. There were whispers of discontent, particularly among those who felt the king was too influenced by his favorites and too willing to make peace with France when England's military position remained strong. For the moment, however, Isabella was safe in her new home. Richard installed her in her own apartments at Westminster Palace, staffed with a carefully chosen household that blended French and English attendants. Her days were filled with lessons, not just in languages and courtly accomplishments, but in the complex etiquette of English court life. She learned to curtsy in the English fashion, to prefer wine over ale at meals, and to speak English with the accent of the court rather than her French tutors. Richard himself took an active interest in her education and welfare. Contemporary chronicles describe him visiting her apartments regularly, bringing her gifts from across his realm, exotic birds from Ireland, fine books from Oxford, musical instruments crafted by London's best artisans. He seemed to genuinely enjoy her company, and she began to look forward to his visits, greeting him with the mixture of formality and affection that marked their unusual relationship. The other children at court quickly accepted Isabella as one of their own. Medieval royal households typically included numerous young nobles being raised and educated alongside the monarch's own family. Isabella found particular friendship with the daughters of Richard's supporters, girls close to her own age, who helped her navigate the subtle hierarchies and unspoken rules of English noble society. Her favorite companion was Margaret Holland, daughter of one of Richard's half-brothers. Margaret was only 2 years older than Isabella, but seemed worldly and sophisticated to the young queen. It was Margaret who taught Isabella English children's games, who helped her understand which ladies-in-waiting could be trusted with secrets, and who warned her about the political undercurrents that even children couldn't entirely escape. The 2 girls would spend hours in Isabella's private garden, practicing their needlework, while Margaret explained the genealogies of English noble houses and the ancient feuds that still simmered beneath the surface of court politeness. Isabella was a quick learner, and her French perspective on English politics often provided insights that surprised her older companions. Why, Isabella once asked Margaret, do the English nobles seem to watch each other so carefully? In France, there are factions and quarrels, but here everyone seems to be waiting for something to happen. Margaret, wise beyond her years, explained that Richard's reign had been marked by conflicts with his nobles almost from the beginning. There had been a major rebellion when he was young, and he had never entirely forgiven those who had opposed him. Meanwhile, many of the great lords believed Richard was too fond of his court favorites and too willing to ignore their advice on matters of war and governance. The king is powerful now, Margaret said, but power in England must be shared with the nobles. Your marriage helps him because it brings peace with France, but some think it shows he is weak, that he prefers negotiation to conquest. Isabella absorbed these lessons with the seriousness of a child who was beginning to understand that her life was connected to forces much larger than herself. She began to watch the interactions at court with new eyes, noticing how certain nobles would fall silent when Richard entered a room, how conversations would shift when she appeared, how even her French ladies-in-waiting seemed to choose their words carefully when discussing political matters. The years 1397 and 1398 passed peacefully for Isabella. She grew from a tiny child into a more confident girl, her English becoming fluent, her understanding of court life more sophisticated. Richard continued to treat her with paternal kindness, and she began to feel genuinely at home in England. The massive stone walls of Westminster became familiar rather than intimidating, and she could navigate the complex maze of corridors and chambers without getting lost. Her education expanded beyond the typical feminine accomplishments of needle work and music. Richard insisted that she learn to read and write in both French and English, and her tutors included some of the finest scholars in the kingdom. She studied history, particularly the chronicles of English and French kings, learning about the great figures whose actions had shaped the world she now inhabited. One of her favorite lessons involved maps. Her tutor, a learned clerk named Master William, would spread great parchments across the floor of her study chamber, showing her the extent of both kingdoms and explaining how geography had influenced centuries of conflict. Isabella would kneel beside these maps, tracing the coastlines with her finger, imagining the ships that carried armies and ambassadors back and forth across the channel. "See here, Your Grace," Master William would say, pointing to the narrow waters between Dover and Cala. This small strip of Isabella, now 9 years old and much more aware than 3 years earlier, understood the implications. "Are you still king?" she asked directly. Richard's smile was bitter. "For now, but Henry Bolingbroke has many supporters, and I may not be able to protect you as I once could." The conversation that followed was unlike any they had ever had. For the first time, Richard spoke to Isabella, not as a child to be sheltered, but as a political equal who needed to grasp her situation. He explained that Henry was claiming the throne, that many great nobles had abandoned Richard's cause, and that both England's future and the peace with France now hung in jeopardy. "What will happen to me?" Isabella asked, showing a calmness that would have been impressive in an adult, let alone a 9-year-old girl. "I don't know," Richard admitted, and Isabella saw that this uncertainty tormented him. "Henry may use you as a bargaining chip with your father, or he may honor our marriage and continue to protect you. Much depends on whether he values peace with France more than his own ambitions." This was Isabella's first real lesson in the harsh realities of medieval politics. Her value as a person was less important than her value as a symbol and a diplomatic tool. The love and care Richard had shown her, though genuine, was now entangled in a shocking new reality. May have been, could not shield her from the larger forces reshaping the English kingdom. The next few weeks passed in agonizing uncertainty. Isabella could hear the sounds of the city beyond the tower walls, but she was cut off from reliable news about what was happening. Her French ladies whispered among themselves in their native tongue, but they seemed to know little beyond rumors and speculation. Finally, on a gray October morning, Isabella heard the sound she had been dreading, the heavy footsteps of armed men approaching her chambers. When the doors opened, she saw not the guards she had become accustomed to, but new men wearing the red rose livery of Henry Bolingbroke. The man who entered behind them was tall and imposing, with the bearing of a soldier and the calculating eyes of a politician. This was Henry himself, now Henry IV of England, come to meet the child who represented both an opportunity and a problem for his new reign. Isabella rose from her chair and curtsied deeply, as she had been taught to do when meeting a king. Henry studied her for a long moment, taking in her poise and her obvious intelligence, perhaps calculating how he might use her. "Your Grace," he said formally, and Isabella noted that he still used her royal title. "I regret that circumstances have made it necessary to discuss your future under such conditions." "What has become of the king?" Isabella asked, referring to Richard, with the directness that had become her hallmark. "Richard of Bordeaux is no longer king," Henry replied, using Richard's birth name rather than his royal title. "He has abdicated in favor of my claim to the throne." Isabella understood enough about politics to know that abdicated likely meant he was forced to give up the crown, but she didn't challenge the euphemism. Instead, she asked the question that mattered most to her immediate future: "What becomes of me?" Henry's answer would determine whether Isabella remained a queen or became merely a valuable prisoner. Her fate hung on the new king's assessment of how best to use the peace treaty with France, whether to maintain it or to risk war for other political objectives. "That," Henry said, "depends on many factors: your father's response to recent events, the advice of my counselors, and perhaps most importantly, your own conduct in the coming months." With those words, 9-year-old Isabella began the most dangerous period of her young life. The protective bubble of Richard's court was gone, replaced by the harsh realities of a kingdom in transition. She was no longer just a child queen being raised to fulfill her royal duties. She was a political prisoner whose value might be weighed against the cost of war or peace. The weeks that followed Richard's deposition were a masterclass in survival for Isabella. Confined to the tower, but not yet formally imprisoned, she had to navigate the treacherous waters of a court still deciding what to do with her. Some of Henry's supporters argued that she should be sent back to France immediately, both to avoid the expense of maintaining her household and to signal that England was ready to renegotiate the peace treaty from a position of strength. Others counseled caution, pointing out that Isabella's presence gave England leverage in any future negotiations with France. As long as she remained in English custody, her father would be reluctant to take any action that might endanger her welfare. This faction argued that she should be kept comfortable, but under careful watch. Isabella herself played her part with remarkable skill for such a young girl. She was unfailingly polite to her new captors, careful never to give offense, or seem to be plotting against Henry's government. At the same time, she maintained the dignity befitting her rank, refusing to be treated as anything less than the queen she legally remained. Her French ladies-in-waiting proved invaluable during this period. Unlike her English attendants, who had been dismissed or fled, these women stayed loyal to Isabella's interests rather than to any English faction. They helped her understand the nuances of her situation and coached her in the careful balance she needed to maintain. Remember, her chief lady-in-waiting, Madame Ducy, advised her, "You are still Queen of England in the eyes of the law and your father's court. Henry may wear the crown, but he has not yet dared to dissolve your marriage or formally end the treaty. As long as that remains true, you have value, and where there is value, there is hope." This hope, however, came with a terrible cost that Isabella was only beginning to understand. Word began to filter into the tower about Richard's fate. First came rumors that he had died in captivity at Pontefract Castle. Then came whispers that his death had not been natural, that Henry's supporters had arranged for the former king to meet with an accident. When Isabella finally received confirmation that Richard was dead, the news hit her with unexpected force. She had never loved Richard as a wife loves a husband. How could she, when she was still a child? But he had been kind to her, had protected her, and had been the closest thing to a father figure she had known since leaving France. His death meant not just personal loss, but the severing of her last connection to the life she had built in England. The manner of Richard's death also carried ominous implications for her own future. If Henry was willing to arrange the murder of an anointed king, what scruples would he have about disposing of a French girl? Isabella, a princess who had outlived her usefulness, faced a difficult situation in early 1400. Henry's government gave her an ultimatum. She could return to France, but only if she formally recognized Henry as the rightful king of England and gave up any claims to the English throne as Richard's widow. From Henry's viewpoint, this proposed agreement was brilliant. By leaving England voluntarily, Isabella would imply that her marriage to Richard had ended because of his deposition. This would release Henry from the original peace treaty's obligations, and he could avoid the political mess of forcibly removing a young queen. For Isabella, the choice was clear-cut. She could either accept exile and admit that her 3 years as Queen of England meant nothing, or she could refuse and risk being a prisoner forever. At just 10 years old, she had to make a decision that would affect her own future and the relationship between England and France for the years ahead. Her French advisors were split. Some felt she should accept the terms and return to her father's court, where she would be safe and cared for, possibly even find a new husband. Others insisted she should refuse, arguing that she remained Richard's legitimate widow and England's rightful queen. Regardless of Henry's actions, Isabella struggled with this decision for weeks. Part of her wanted to go back to France to reunite with her family and escape the uncertain atmosphere of Henry's court. Another part recognized that accepting Henry's terms would betray Richard's memory and abandon the peace he tried to uphold. Ultimately, events beyond her control made the decision for her. Charles V, during one of his clearer moments, sent word that he expected her to return to France immediately. The message, relayed through diplomatic channels, indicated that continued discussions about Isabella's status would be seen as hostile by the French crown. Facing the threat of renewed war, Henry's government quickly agreed to Isabella's departure. The terms of her release were vague, allowing both sides to view her return as either voluntary or forced, depending on their political needs. The journey back to France in the summer of 1401 was bittersweet for Isabella. She was leaving the only home she had known for 5 years, abandoning the rooms where she had learned English poetry, the gardens where she played with Margaret Holland, and the great hall where she had been crowned queen. Yet, she was returning to a family and a country that felt foreign after her time in England. She now spoke French with a slight English accent, preferred English styles to French ones, and had to relearn the etiquette of her father's court. The little girl who left Paris at 6 was returning as an 11-year-old young woman, shaped by experiences her French family could not fully understand. The reunion with her parents was complicated by her father's declining mental health. Charles V was experiencing one of his worst episodes when Isabella arrived, believing he was being hunted by insane FOs and not recognizing his own family. When he finally emerged from his state several weeks later, he appeared confused by Isabella's presence, as if he had forgotten she had been married to the English king. Her mother, Isabel, offered a warmer welcome, but she was also calculating. The Queen of France immediately considered how Isabella's unique position could be used to advance French interests. As the widow of an English king, Isabella held a certain diplomatic status that could be useful in future negotiations. More immediately, her experience at the English court made her a valuable source of information about English politics and military strength. Isabella found herself caught between these competing demands on her loyalty and knowledge. She was French by birth and back on her native soil, but she had also been Queen of England and felt some obligation to the country that had been her home. When her mother's advisors asked about English defenses or Henry's support among the nobility, she answered cautiously, giving general information while avoiding specifics that could be used for military plans. The months following her return to France were a time of adjustment and reflection for Isabella. She was no longer a child, but not yet fully grown. At 11, she had already experienced more political turmoil and personal loss than many face in a lifetime. Now, the question was what role she would play in the tangled world of medieval European politics. Her status as a former Queen of England made her an attractive marriage prospect for various European nobles, but it also complicated potential unions. Some suitors were intimidated by her royal rank and political importance. Others were more focused on the benefits of marrying her than on Isabella herself. Having seen the impact of political marriages through her experiences with Richard, she had strong opinions about marriage. She understood how such unions could bring protection and stability, but also how quickly they could fall apart when situations changed. Any future husband would need to